how businesses are owned, specifically identifying the three basic legal forms of a business. In fact, if you were to start a business on your own, one of the first issues you'd have to address is what is in fact the legal character of my business? The three basic legal forms are a proprietorship, or a partnership, or a corporation. And in fact, you will have to make a conscious decision as to whether you're going to operate legally in one of those three forms, and we will discuss some of the derivatives of those forms a little bit later. Let's begin here by focusing on a proprietorship. What is a proprietorship? A proprietorship is a business that's started by one owner. For example, if you wanted to just kind of start your own little window washing here business while you're at college, you could basically say, you don't even have to say, you just go out and make business cards and go out and start handing them out, and you are effectively, by default, operating as a proprietorship. It's just you, and you're the owner, and you're trying to operate the business. There is really no legal red tape in operating as a proprietorship, except if you start to hire employees. And it is perfectly okay for a proprietor, owner of a business, my window washing business, to go out and hire some employees. When I do that, I am going to become subject to federal law in terms of hiring practices and the payment of payroll taxes and maybe even some safety issues and these kinds of things. I suppose there might be also a little bit of red tape. In some municipalities and cities, the city may require you to actually have a business license, but that's a simple thing. Just call up the city and say, hey, I'm starting a window washing business. Do I need any kind of a license? And if there is a requirement for that, they'll have you come down and fill out a simple form, maybe pay hopefully a small fee, and you're in operation. If, in fact, you are selling products, you may come under a state's sales tax and may need to call the state tax commission or other collection agency and determine whether or not you're going to have to fill out forms in those forms. But really, getting into business as a proprietor is a fairly simple thing. One of the things that you should be aware of about a proprietorship is that if you operate a business as a proprietorship, there is no separation of the business from your personal legal liability. Now, let me explain what I mean. Let's assume you're out there and you get your first customer and you've started the business. You've got a ladder and a bucket and a squeegee, and you're up there and you're washing a window, and unfortunately you slip. And you're about ready to go down, but you kind of grab the windowsill, and the ladder kind of explodes almost right through the window, and there's glass flying. You get a little cut, but it's not too bad. But unfortunately, you look in, and there's this little, there's this child that's, thank goodness, she's not seriously hurt, but she's been frightened and maybe has a little cut or something. Mom comes up there, she's screaming. She's gone bananas. How could you possibly have done this to her little girl? How traumatized. And she's totally upset. And what do we do in America when we're upset? You're right, we sue. And let's assume that she sues us, says we were incompetent or negligent or whatever, and created damage, might be permanent relative to her child. In this particular case, she files a lawsuit and we find ourselves in court, and maybe in fact, if in fact we were maybe a little negligent or something like that, if she's successful in this lawsuit, then there might be a legitimate claim against the business. And in fact, if there are some damages and we're required to pay damages, I might, they have a claim and a right to attach any of my assets of the business or resources. They could take my ladder, my squeegee, my bucket, and all these things. Well, it didn't cost much anyway. Go ahead. But in a proprietorship, there is no separation of the business resources and your own personal resources relative to legal liability. And so not only could they take your squeegee and your ladder, but they could also come in and say, hey, you got to pay these damages, and if you can't pay it with your business resources, that's tough luck. I want your boat, your house, your car, your kids. Of course, maybe the kids really aren't worth that much. I don't know. It depends on, your relationship there as to whether that's something that, whether you'd have to sell them or not, but just kidding. I know, I'm just kidding. So don't get too upset about that. But anyways, that's serious. I mean, that's a true risk. I mean, why would anybody ever want to start a business like that as a proprietorship and expose, their personal livelihood and future to that kind of potential liability? Of course, this can be addressed through liability insurance, and anybody operating as a proprietor should get some liability insurance to make sure that they are protected in the event of some kind of something like this. Of course, I suppose even if you don't have any personal assets, let's assume, the squeegee and the ladder and the like, but you don't have a home and a boat and you're not married and these kinds of things, maybe then you'd say to yourself, well, I don't really have anything to lose, so who really cares in that particular case? But generally speaking, you'd be well advised to get some liability insurance if, in fact, you're going to be operating as a proprietor. The last thing that I'd like to note here that is distinctive is that proprietorships not only operate as a single entity in terms of the owner and the business in terms of legal liability, but that's also true in terms of income taxation. In other words, if you make any profit in that business or loss, it will be reflected directly on your personal income tax return. And the business is not taxed separately. All of the income or losses of the business are taken to you directly as the owner, as income or as a deduction in the event of a loss. The second form of a basic legal form of business ownership is referred to as a partnership. Now, this is basically the same as a proprietorship, except there's just more than one owner. Hey, it's me, again, starting a window washing business, or you, and we're going to do it together now. Maybe we do it together just because, hey, we want some company, or maybe we're going to buy a squeegee and ladder, and I don't have enough money to buy those things, but you've got, and we do it 50-50, and so we'll just kind of combine our resources and do it together. And we'll make our name cards up, and it has both of our names on it. And theoretically, I don't have to do anything else but simply operate with more than one person to effectively be a partnership by default. Again, in terms of red tape, it's basically the same as a proprietorship. There really is no significant legal red tape unless we're going to hire employees, which we can as a partnership. And we may need a business license from the local city and may have sales taxes if we're selling products subject to state sales tax. And so there may be some of that on the, but again, that isn't necessarily too significant. However, I strongly recommend that if in fact you're going to get involved in a partnership, that you have a formal partnership agreement drawn up and executed and signed by all of the partners. Now, this is not mandatory. You can have a partnership that's legally in force on a handshake. But it is so much better to actually get down in writing exactly what the expectations are of the partners, what you plan to do in the business, and who's putting up how much money, and how you're going to split the profits. And if things don't work out, how would you buy me out or I buy you out, and how would we terminate the business? And try and expect and anticipate all of the things that could happen, and whether they be good or bad, and then how those would be dealt with. Many times you have partners who don't pay attention to those kinds of things, and a few months into it, they regret it because now, they've made some money, and one person's working harder than the other, at least they think so, and there's disagreements on how the profits are to be split, and all of a sudden there are significant problems. If you can anticipate these kinds of issues, it's very helpful. And so many times I recommend that even if you're starting a partnership and don't have any legal requirement for an agreement, that you have one done and may want to get an attorney who really knows the kinds of issues that need to be addressed up front. Of course, there are some software programs that give you some boilerplate forms of partnership agreements that might be useful in that process also. One of the things to note is in a partnership, as in a proprietorship, there is no separation of the business and the personal assets of the partners relative to legal liability. Again, let's assume that we're, doing the window washing, and we're up there and one of the partners is on one side of the building, the other's on the other. And again, one of them slips through the window, some damage, a lawsuit and claims made that have to be fulfilled. And again, the squeegee and the ladder can be taken. But not only might the partner who actually caused the damage, their personal assets be attached and taken, but also the other partner. Wow, this is serious. We better get some liability insurance, or we may need to consider some other form of business ownership if in fact we want to avoid that kind of personal liability for problems that may be associated with the business. Just as in a proprietorship, there is no separate legal liability. There also is no separate income taxation of the business relative to the partners personally. In other words, from an income tax standpoint, the partnership will pay no tax. To the extent that there's any profit or losses, that will be allocated based on the percentage partnership interest to the individual partners to be reflected on their tax returns personally. The other legal form of business operation, business ownership, is a corporation. And really the corporation was originally devised to avoid this problem of joint legal liability between a business and the owners of the business. A corporation is a separate legal entity, separate and apart from its owners. As a result, there is more legal red tape associated in the formation of a corporation. It's actually the state, each individual state, that imposes a requirement necessary to allow the state to authorize this separate legal entity. In a corporation, there can be one or more owners. It doesn't have to be just more owners. You could be the sole owner of a corporation. But it would be accounted for and treated as a separate entity from a business standpoint and your own. A corporate form of business greatly facilitates many owners and the easy transfer of ownership interests, so businesses that feel like they're going to have the need to raise capital and have many owners involved in that process, maybe even go public and get capital from the general public, will probably want to use some kind of a corporate form of doing business because it really facilitates the process of bringing in those owners and allowing them to then sell their ownership interests before the dissolution of the business if they wish to. Again, the critical point relative to a corporation is its legal separate status, such that in the event that my partner and I, and again, in this particular case, he's not really a partner, he's a co-owner in a corporation, if in fact we form a corporation under which we'll operate our window washing business. In this particular case, again, the same scenario, one of the owners who's working there, on the business, goes through the window, damage inflicted, a lawsuit filed, and claims made, and what can be attached? In this particular case, under a corporate form, the personal assets of the owners are not subject to any attachment due to damage inflicted relative to the business operations. So any claims would be limited only to the squeegee and the ladder and the bucket. And I'm not at risk of losing my house and my car, my family, and these kinds of things. And so you can see how this would be a very, very attractive way to set up the business ownership. Again, businesses that have valuable assets will probably want the business to buy business liability insurance so that the business assets aren't threatened in the event of damage and lawsuits, but it's probably not quite as significant, at least in terms of personal assets in this particular case, because there is protection. Here is the big downside relative to a corporation. Because a corporation is a separate legal entity, many categories of our government have decided that, hey, it's a separate entity. It ought to be taxed separately. And the federal government has chosen to tax corporations separately And in fact, that creates a situation that I would refer to as double taxation. Who are the owners of business? The owners of business are those who invest capital in the business and therefore take the risk associated with that capital, the possibility that the business ideas may actually not come to fruition. Those who invest capital in a corporation as a legal form of doing business are referred to as the shareholders or stockholders. These shareholders or stockholders will elect a board of directors to represent their interests in the general business decisions. And many times the board of directors will do this for a fee and, in fact, may own shares of stock themselves, but they do not necessarily have to. It's the board of directors then acting on behalf of the shareholders who hires top management personnel who manage the business typically for a salary and in many cases for some options or opportunities to be compensated also in the form of stock potential ownership. Top management personnel hires other employees who work for a salary or wage, and in some cases may actually participate in pension or profit-sharing plans that also give them a vested interest in the future of the business and its ultimate profitability because they may actually be allowed some kind of an ownership stake. As a result of the efforts of employees and managers, hopefully the company produces profits, which then go to the shareholders or owners as a return on their investment, justifying the original capitalization of the business. Ultimately, who are the shareholders of the business? Well, I think I mentioned this before, but again, who owns the shares or who owns the businesses? Who provides the capital for businesses in America? Well, it's you and me. It's your parents and grandparents. It's Americans. It's people. Now, you may say, well, but some of the biggest shareholders are other companies or institutions or pension plans or insurance companies or financial institutions. Well, yes, but each of those are owned ultimately by shareholders. And finally, it's us. It's people. Sometimes we look at corporations and its business as some kind of an evil empire. And many times, we talk about taxing those businesses because, they deserve to be taxed because but let's face it, when in fact business is taxed, who is being taxed? It's you and me. And in fact, if it's business that really is acting in the that we're going to accuse of not necessarily, providing or making any contribution to society, remember, it's us. It's the people who are putting up the money to ultimately realize the benefits of ideas, to provide goods or services to people. Gathering capital in order to provide goods and services that people want and are willing to pay for. And ultimately, if they're quality goods and services, hopefully they'll improve people's lives.